What's going on, everyone? John Matrix here. Hope you're all having yourselves a wonderful day. We're going to be jumping back into some more Kaiserreich Universe reactions here with Kaiser Cat Cinema. It's been a pretty interesting journey so far, going through this alternate history timeline, essentially about what if Germany won World War I, and just seeing how I don't want to necessarily say a lot of minor changes, but a lot of changes to different things in history, like Germans backing off on their submarine incursions, and that essentially didn't provoke America into helping join the war, and how, you know, syndicalism, which is, I guess, you know, a type of socialism, formed in France after its fall, and then that spread into Britain, which led to a revolution, and the British monarchy got, you know, exiled, and they have since gone to Canada, and they have an alliance with what was left over of like the French monarchy, and they've gone, you know, the British version of syndicalism has even gone even more radical, and I think they're called like totalitarists or something like that. And then with Russia, how they had a civil war going on, and Lenin got assassinated and the Bolsheviks were defeated, but then, you know, there was a divide between authoritarians and Democrats, and now they're on the verge of another civil war potentially happening over there, etc., etc. It's been fascinating so far. So I think in this video here, this is the 5th video in this series. This is Kaiserreich Universe Documentary, Episode 5, A Place in the Sun. I think this is going to get into what's happened with Germany since they won the First World War, and you know, all the political things that are happening with them since that, and I guess, you know, with everything else going on around them. So interesting to see what we're getting into with this video. Links, as always, will be down below in the description to the original video without my commentary and reaction, and to Kaiser Cat Cinema's channel. So please check those out if you've been enjoying going through this documentary series as much as I have. You know, click those links, go over there, give these videos a like, and give the man a sub. If you'd like to join us when we do these reactions live, there is a join button underneath the video, as well as a link in the description to the YouTube membership benefits and tiers that I offer. If you've been around the channel for a while and decide you want to take your sport to the next level, you know, check those out and see if any of that would have any interest for you. But all that said, my dudes, let's jump into the video. So again, this is episode 5 in this Kaiserreich Universe documentary, A Place in the Sun. Check it out.
In 1864, the German Empire had been nothing more than a motley collection of squabbling principalities. When the Iron Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, embarked upon his great mission to unite the fragmented remnants of the Holy Roman Empire, perhaps not even he could have foreseen the outcome of his ambitious project. The German Empire unified in 1871, initially presenting itself to the world as a keeper of peace. In Bismarck's own words, Germany was to be an honest broker between nations.
Interesting.
This, however, began to change in 1890.
Bro, I can't
new
get over those
Kaiser,
spiky helmets.
Wilhelm II, embarked onto an entirely new foreign political course in an effort to achieve the same hegemonic ambitions as the long-established European powers of Britain, Russia, and France. Germany's erratic, undiplomatic behavior on the global stage and her massive buildup of both the navy and the military scared the powers of old. To challenge Germany, centuries-old rivalries and conflicts were suddenly set aside. Instead, France, Great Britain, and Russia formed a united front against the young, vigorous, and aspiring Germans, the Triple Entente. Bismarck's famous nightmare of coalitions had become a reality. In many ways, a great war between these great powers was inevitable.
Yeah, that's the thing, is like World War I was pretty much always inevitable, and then the aftermath of World War I leading into World War II was also pretty much inevitable.
What many believed would be a short war, however, became a long and bitter war of attrition. As a generation of youth was slowly ground to dust in the killing fields of France, the hoped American intervention did not come. The United States declared their neutrality, Russia faltered, Britain sued for peace.
It's also, it's kind of interesting too, like in both world wars, America really wanted no part of it, but they were drawn into the wars by other parties getting involved in things, you know.
And the Entente collapsed. In late 1919, Germany and her Central Power allies emerged victorious from the Great War, their so-called Weltkrieg. Against all odds, a country that was barely 50 years old had asserted itself against France, Britain, and Russia, the dominant powers of the last century, on two fronts. Unbeknownst to Germany at the time, this watershed victory would become a catalyst for worldwide turmoil. From the collapsing French, Russian, and British empires, new ideologies such as syndicalism would emerge to challenge Germany.
Like, how much would that suck, right? Like, you have a big victory over a major nation like France, and you know, get a lot of their colonies and territories abroad, and you know, that gains you more wealth, etc. And you expect them to kind of collapse and weaken to a point where they won't be able to probably challenge you for a while, only for the opposite to happen, and a new rise of you know, syndicalism happens that only unites the country and strengthens them even further, you know, against you.
But they would do so as underdogs in a world now dominated by the German Empire and her subjects. In 1920, Germany has finally found her place in the sun, and the world would witness the age of the Kaiserreich.
There it is, the title. The Kaiserreich. Dude, Hell's Reach was so good, man.
By 1920, Germany had emerged from the Great War and was now beginning to enjoy the fruits of victory. Her foes were now utterly beaten. France and Russia found themselves in the midst of leftist revolutions, and Britain had all but retreated to her island. However, as often, appearances can be quite deceiving. Like their defeated enemies, the Central Powers had been pushed to the breaking point. Hunger and poverty were rampant. An entire generation sacrificed to win the war to end all wars. Even in victory, the Austro-Hungarians and Ottomans were on uneven footing, barely clinging on to their vast multi-ethnic empires, while the Bulgarians struggled to establish order in their now vastly overstretched Tsardom. In Germany itself, the situation was not any better. Already in September 1918, socialist agitators had tried to launch an uprising in various northern German cities,
That doesn't
though
surprise
without
me.
much success.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me that socialism in some form would have tried, especially with how syndicalism formed in France, and then of course the opposite side of the line with the Bolsheviks, you know, taking power for, in this history timeline, you know, them taking power for a brief period. Germany was basically surrounded by socialist factions, so it wouldn't surprise me that they would have kind of an uprising and unrest, as socialist factions would have probably, you know, started rising up in their borders as well.
These so-called September insurrections only further increased the far-reaching power of the military.
Yikes.
Over the years,
Dudes
the
are just
German
dropping shit on
Supreme
'em.
Army Command had concentrated around Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff. In many ways, these two men established an indirect wartime dictatorship over the country. While all relevant democratic institutions remained in place, the legendary reputation and perceived irreplaceability of the two generals practically gave them a political blank check. This enabled this diarchy to enforce the dismissal of unpleasant rivals and the halt of political reform, bending all matters of state toward the needs of the military.
Yeah, they basically got to do what they wanted.
After the end of the war, long boiling tensions between the military leadership and the German people began to surface. The general populace, represented by their parliament, the so-called Reichstag, and even the Kaiser, became openly hostile to the military. With the economy in shambles and societal upheaval threatening the borders of the empire, the German people headed to the streets to demand political reform and stable foreign relations with France and Russia. While Ludendorff opposed any kind of political concessions, he was eventually overruled. Now that the war was over, the military leadership was not seen as indispensable anymore, and thus Ludendorff had lost his last bargaining chip. The final nail in Ludendorff's coffin was the Caesarean betrayal of his longtime ally, Hindenburg, who sided with the Kaiser and the government in exchange for protecting the military against reform. In February 1920, Germany's once widely feared supposed dictator was ousted in the most unspectacular way possible, simply being dismissed by the Kaiser. Now nothing stood in the way of the long-awaited reforms anymore. Only a month later, the government, in accordance with the Reichstag, passed a set of progressive constitutional reforms that would finally...
Yeah, I couldn't imagine just this alone, like the amount of time it would have taken to research and find all of this historical footage and trying to cut it together. Like, that alone's pretty impressive.
Finally turned Germany into a parliamentary monarchy in all but name. Thanks to Hindenburg's secret deal, the army remained largely untouched by these reforms and continued to enjoy a vast degree of autonomy. It would take some time for Germany to recover both politically and militarily from the effects of the Great War. Luckily, the empire was blessed with the appearance of a new, talented statesman to help Germany navigate the difficult post-war years. The liberal and internationally respected diplomat Wilhelm Solf was appointed Chancellor after Germany's first peacetime election. Immediately, Solf withstood his trial by fire by negotiating Germany away from a new Franco-German war in the Haute-Savoie crisis of May 1920. Thanks to his cabinet's keen action, peace and stability quickly returned to the European continent, and Germany's global reputation began to improve again. By the first half of the 1920s, it seemed like Germany had finally found her place in the sun. As that age-old saying goes, to the victor go the spoils. Germany's new diplomatic foreign policy was to herald a new era of German hegemony.
So, off the bat here, before we get any further, it's looking like the Roaring Twenties that was taking place in real life in America. Looks like that might be happening in Germany here now.
At the start of the 1920s, things began looking less bleak for the victorious empire. Having found a newfound sense of optimism, the political winds were shifting in Berlin. Bolstered by progressive reform, the city's liberal elite had begun a rapid transformation. With London in decline and Paris in the throes of revolution, the sprawling German metropole saw an enormous influx of foreign artists, dignitaries, writers, and intellectuals. New music and art influences raged throughout the German Empire, bringing with them a sense of exoticism and hope. Germany was now the center of the world, after all, and her bars and cafes were bustling day and night with all the ambitions of a newly formed European elite. While the idea of a German-led Europe was a project of imperialists and technocrats, that did not stop the empire's young radicals from dreaming of a new European world order. In their eyes, German victory in the war could be the catalyst for a future where democracy and monarchism went hand in hand. Some spoke of this federation of equals as Mittel Europa, a wider European bloc with a common currency at the heart of Europe, and perhaps one day, the world.
So they essentially were trying to make the European Union already back then, but with Germany at its heart.
Immediate German post-war politics were defined by a sharp break between old and new. The conservative and national liberal Old Guard suddenly found themselves in the opposition against progressive forces that only a few decades prior had been defamed as enemies of the empire. These progressives were social liberals, Catholics, and social democrats. The first two post-war cabinets under Chancellor Solf and his successor Erzberger were the first German governments with participation of the Social Democratic Party, SDP, and saw a modest shift to the left. This progressive government of the German Empire was, unfortunately, not to be long-lived. Already during the mid-20s, the Social Democratic SDP was forced to the opposition bench again. Two ambitious social reforms had scared the political establishment and conservative members of the coalition. To make matters worse, constant squabbles within the cabinet had made even the more progressive parties wonder if the SDP was truly fit to govern the country. The difficulties faced by the civil government were only exacerbated by the whims of Kaiser Wilhelm. Now Europe's first monarch among equals, he was a capricious and incoherent ruler at best.
Yeah, I wonder how that makes him feel, right? He's supposed to be kind of a monarchy, but now, like, his power doesn't seem to be as great as it was almost before the war, right?
And victory had not made the German Kaiser mild. As an old-style ruler, fruitful cooperation between the monarch and the more left-leaning ministers turned out to be quite difficult. Thus, for the rest of the decade, Germany would be ruled by a new broad coalition of liberals, Catholics, and conservatives, commonly referred to as the March Coalition.
Interesting.
This new, more conservative coalition aimed to maintain the accomplishments of the 1920 March Constitution without radical reform. This entailed excluding both the left-wing SDP and the far right from government affairs. The champion of this political constellation was Chancellor Ulrich von Brockdorff-Rantzau, who served from 1924 until his death in 1928, and under whose guidance Germany weathered the hardships of the troubled mid-20s. After Brockdorff's passing, however, things began to slowly decline. Over the following years, the March Coalition would remain in power, but their popularity began to slowly erode. Germany's emerging European order seemed to be more and more challenged by her resurgent neighbors.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, again, everywhere around Germany seems to have been unified in some way or another. Whereas Germany, even though it won the war and has gained a lot more influence and wealth, they seem to be divided politically. They don't really know, like the monarchy doesn't have as much power anymore. The populace is wanting more reforms. There's a lot of political strife between, what would be, I guess, considered left-wing radicals at this time and more conservative members from the old guard. Essentially, it seems to be, the old guard, now that the war is over, isn't needed anymore, and Germany's wanting to move into, I guess, kind of more of a, modernized government, if that's the proper term, So I don't know. It's just interesting seeing how, like, France, Britain, a lot of these other major powers that lost the war and had collapses have since actually united and have come back stronger under, syndicalism and totalism or something like that, where Germany's still trying to figure itself out. I find that interesting.
The German people had feared that the Reichstag's weak foreign policy had gambled away Germany's hard-earned victory for their own interests. In the years before, nationalists felt Germany had not done enough to contain the defeated powers to the east and west. The price of German inaction was yet another dangerous geopolitical insult.
And that also, to me, like, I would assume that there probably would be a big group of people in Germany that were upset that they didn't take more, right? Like, France lost, they should gain more of, the French territories, just gotten more from the war. I feel like that also probably would have been a big sentiment throughout Germany, but maybe I'm wrong. Yeah, it's accurate. They want the old guard thing. Yeah.
Encirclement of the German bloc, just like in 1914. These fears would weaken Germany's moderate cabinets, strengthening the opposition on both the left and the right. The effects would be far-reaching. Eventually,
it's so interesting that all of these countries after World War I are basically going through civil war upheavals. France, Britain, Russia, and now even Germany looks like that's kind of where they're heading with opposing political parties.
Leading right-wing intellectual Ulrich von Hassel's nationalist Fatherland Party to gain enormous popularity in the late 20s. Meanwhile, internal leftist agitation was still snaking through the empire, threatening to tear apart the old constellations of power. This gave momentum to Germany's rising nationalism, seeking a newly assertive foreign policy for a darker age. In the early 1920s, fearing the rise of syndicalism, Germany began an attempt to normalize relations with Great Britain. With France in the throes of syndicalist revolution and Russia in tatters, Germany realized a second stabilizing monarchy was needed to keep Europe on the right track.
Yeah.
Relations between the former Central Powers had cooled, mostly over disputes about former Russian territory, so Germany hoped the British Empire could be a balancing counterweight in the West. These attempts at diplomacy would fail, however, as hate across the Channel ran deep.
Yeah.
Germany could not have...
Yeah, Britain's a proud nation. They're not going to be happy about, trying to settle and make any kind of alliances after, in their eyes, losing the war.
Relations with Great Britain, London claimed, while at the same time working to undermine the pound as global currency. Then Britain's last lifeline for her tattered economy. In the end, the proud Germans decided not to pursue further relations, but to focus their attention inward. After all, many of Germany's dependencies still faced post-war turmoil, and the Scarlet Shadow was still haunting continental Europe. Apart from internal stabilization, the first order of business for the post-war governments was to re-establish order and the rule of law in the newly conquered Eastern European territories. In autumn 1921, the final peace treaty between Germany and the Russian Provisional Government was signed, forcing the Russians to recognize the new German order in Eastern Europe, and proving to the German government that their late change in Eastern policy had paid out.
Yeah, we went over this in the previous video.
1919, when the former Russian Empire was still locked in brutal civil war, the Germans had initially gambled on the victory of the Bolsheviks. While this was naturally a very controversial decision, the German Foreign Office believed that it would be easier to keep an entirely isolated and unstable Russian socialist regime under German control than a Russia dominated by revanchist white forces. Germany would change her approach after the assassination of Lenin. With the leader of the revolution dead and much of the Red Army routed out of southern Russia, the Bolshevik front began to see major setbacks. At this point, the war could still tilt either way, but the Bolsheviks emerged as the less reliable and more internally divided partner. To Berlin, it became apparent that the hidden hand of Germany was needed once again to steer history in the right direction. The Germans finally adopted a policy of reluctant pro-white support. Via proxies in the east, Germany began supplying weapons to the Russian government. Ironically, most of these weapons had been captured from the Imperial Russian Army during the Eastern Offensive's mere months.
Yeah, but they went over this a little bit in the previous video about the Russian Civil War and how Germany started to have more of an influence in the Russian democratic government, and a lot of the Russian populace wasn't happy about that because obviously they just weren't happy about losing the war to Germany, and now Germany is importing, or I guess exporting to Russia, German weaponry, German goods, setting up railroads and trainways, between the countries, etc., etc.
months earlier.
Seeming like it seemed, I guess the picture could have been taken that, even though the war is over, Germany is still taking more away from them.
Now they were smuggled back into war-torn Russia under this unusual alliance of convenience. German support went further inside her own sphere of influence. In the German-occupied territories in Eastern Europe, selected white-aligned detachments like the Western Volunteer Army were built and trained from scratch. While many Russians despised Germany, the collapse of the Entente and American neutrality meant that white forces had lost precious allies on the world.
Germany, like in this timeline, is kind of like the unneutral version of like Sweden or Switzerland, right? They're just happy to deal with whoever that will benefit them, and they don't really do it in a very nonchalant way.
World stage. Eventually, this alliance of former enemies helped the Whites to push back the Red Menace successfully, finally leading to the end of the Russian Civil War in 1921. The Bolsheviks were defeated,
the Emperor
but it was not to be the end of the Red Menace for Europe. In the West, other revolutionaries saw more success. Germany had allowed the French syndicalists to claim full control of continental France, relegating the remaining loyalists to a rump state in Africa.
Yeah, it's interesting how in this timeline, Germany focused more on the Russian front and didn't pay attention as much to the Western side of, the Western side of things with France, and that's looking like it's foreshadowing that's going to lead to what sparks World War II.
While the German old guard balked at this foreign political course once again, the government stuck to their pragmatic approach this time. It was thought that a socialist, internationally isolated France would have no possibility to ever breach containment, thus remaining firmly in the German sphere of influence.
They were wrong on that.
The Commune of France, unlike the old Republic, promised to uphold the Treaty of Versailles and cooperate with the German Empire. While the Prussian elites of the empire did little to hide their contempt for these spineless Frenchmen, it was generally agreed upon that France was no longer a threat to the German bloc.
Yeah.
If the revolution could not spread from mighty Russia, it definitely would not spread from puny France. History would prove otherwise.
Yep.
2 years later, the Kaiser would open his morning papers to discover a syndicalist revolution had taken several cities in Great Britain. Having learned from their own revolution, the French had been secretly agitating and arming the British syndicalists as well, forming an effective partisan force to take control of the Isles. The British syndicalists, later united under Arthur Cook, emerged from the shadows in a coup de grace and claimed full control over the heart of the British Empire, once the vanguard of stability, within less than 1.5 years. As British nobles fled to Canada, shock spread through Germany, who saw the...
But Germany was wishing they rethought that whole treaty with Britain about now, huh?
supposedly stable British Empire fall to syndicalism in one
Might have wanted to put
swoop.
a little more effort into those diplomatic
Initially,
relations.
the British syndicalist revolution was not seen as a credible threat by German intelligence, and the fall of London came as a surprise. Facing popular anti-war sentiment, Germany was not able to respond to these new threats in any effective way.
Yep.
Mere consideration of an intervention was
Yep.
met with overwhelming protests in the streets of Berlin. This led to the Stresemann crisis of 1924 that eventually toppled the government and gave power to the March coalition.
Because now they're surrounded on unified fronts. You know, they've got from Italy up through Britain unified under syndicalism. And then you've got Russia on the other side that's been unified, or well, is looking like it's going towards some kind of unification. And there's not going to be really a whole lot of room for Germany to breathe in this scenario.
It was, as the French said, a fait accompli, a done deal.
Right, yeah,
With
exactly.
two former great powers now under syndicalism.
Neither of them are good. Neither of those are good, Kelshman. Having the totalists, whatever, totalists, and then yeah, potential fascist regime that might overthrow the democratic powers in Russia and taking power there, which could be even worse than, what Lenin and Stalin would have led to. And then you're caught right smack dab in the middle there, little Germany.
Sway, a new ideology began spreading through Europe. This new branch of syndicalism, called Surrealism, began agitating, not for peace with Germany, but for peace under a syndicalist world order.
Yeah.
For the first time ever, Germany understood and feared the words world revolution.
When we informed the Reichstag of the British Revolution, they scoffed at the ideas that our old enemy would ever be able to challenge us again. Who could blame them? The nobles, licking the Kaiser's boots, were safe in their manners in Berlin, redrawing the European map. But they were not in London like we were when the revolution came. I saw early on that these syndicalists were no disorganized rabble like the Bolsheviks had been. The repression in the Union of Britain was swift, brutal, and deadly. In a matter of weeks,
they weren't playing around in
the
Britain.
regime had fled or disappeared from the initial sites of revolution. I warned Berlin then, but they would not listen. The British Empire would not be able to endure without the guiding hand of London, and no empire dies easily. It would have not mattered even if we had known. The German Empire in 1926 was asleep at the wheel. We had been lulled into a false sense of security by the progressive governments of the early 1920s.
Well, I mean, they won the war and they thought that's all. They thought everything was done, essentially. They thought it was over. They won the war, but the war never actually really ended, is kind of the situation that has developed here. All it did was just lead to more turmoil in other parts of the world. And, Germany, again, essentially, geographically, amongst other things, is just kind of caught in the middle.
By an easy victory in Russia, and by our own illusions of German grandeur. While we enjoyed our place in the sun, something was growing in the shadows. In the dark crevices of Europe and in the minds of men everywhere was an idea of revenge. Revenge not just against our homeland, but against everything Germany represents. The very idea of monarchy and empire. The pillars upon which we had built our empire were now seen as the rotting relics of a bygone era. With socialism on the rise, we found ourselves in the position of the ancient regimes of the 19th century. And
they did. The voice acting on these quotes has been top notch.
Every day we slumbered, the syndicalists grew in power. We had defeated the French and the British, yes, but gave no consideration to what came after. Our politicians would do well to remember that when you push against history, history will always push back.
Not long after, German fears of encirclement had become bitter reality. Years after the fall of Britain, another, and perhaps even more concerning development was occurring on Germany's eastern flank. A new populist leader by the name of Boris Savinkov had begun rallying large sections of the Russian populace with a distinct anti-German rhetoric. Savinkov capitalized on the deep-seated frustration and hatred of the Russian people against their humiliation in the Great War. His Motherland Party promised a return to the greatness of the Russian Empire, and on the streets of Moscow, it was whispered Savinkov would not just be president, but a leader, a vozhd, of all Russian people.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I feel like Germany failed to recognize in this alternate timeline situation is just that, right? Like, they were the last empire. All the other empires around them crumbled. And without those empires left to rule, the working man is going to have to rise up and take the reins. And of course, you know, after being under the rule of various monarchies for however long it's been, and after going through a grueling and brutal war that, you know, took their families and friends away from them, and being misled by previous governments, then of course, like, you're gonna be surrounded by that, essentially. And so it's a situation where it's like, the war didn't really end, you know. For Germany to remain the empire that they were, they really needed to actually, like, conquer France. They needed to actually, like, physically take that territory and hold it. But unfortunately, they didn't have the manpower to do it then. And yeah, it just they concentrated more on the Russian front, thinking that France wouldn't be able to do anything after its collapse, and obviously they were wrong, you know. And it led to an even worse thing for them, essentially.
The rising Russian threat not only deeply worried Berlin, but even more so the various German client states in Eastern Europe. These so-called Oststaaten, or Eastern States, were slowly becoming a central pillar of Germany's post-war economic order. This project became known as Mittel Europa, or the Central European Bloc. This economic alliance had been a political project of a group commonly referred to as the National Liberal Bourgeoisie. National, because this faction ultimately sought to expand Germany's power. Liberal, because they did so through economic predominance rather than aggressive foreign domination. It didn't hurt, of course, that they consisted mostly of bankers and industrialists, all of whom stood to gain personally from an economic approach to Germany's eastern flank.
Right.
Together, they leveraged their...
Well, I mean, that also makes sense because, like, after the war, you know, Germany's taken that territory and now it needs to be developed. So it only makes sense that bankers and, you know, businessmen would take root there and find ways to profit from that and become figures of power.
Their economic power and political influence to vastly expand their holdings in the East. The aim of Mittel Europa, ultimately, was to secure German economic hegemony over the continent, with heavy protective tariffs for non-member nations. Chief among these treaties was the economically exploitative Vilnius Agreement of 1926. Unequal treaties such as these played no small part in the rise of Russian nationalism, spearheaded by Savinkov. The economic bloc had more uplifting goals as well, of course. Mittel Europa fostered far-reaching cooperation between the various bloc members over the years, leading to the establishment of a complex alliance network, colloquially referred to as the Reichspakt, the Imperial Pact. To understand the new German order in Eastern Europe, however, we must first travel back to 1918 and the last chaotic months of the Great War. In 1918, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk had signed away enormous swathes of land in Eastern Europe to Germany. Even during the war, the Germans had sought close cooperation with the budding independence movements in these areas, well aware that German-aligned client states would have a greater value than direct annexations. In Eastern Europe, realpolitik, pragmatism, and level-headedness would prevail over the far right's extreme demands for territory. Nonetheless, the various newly formed nations would have wildly varying degrees of autonomy. While normally independent, the Kaiserreich ensured strong German ties would influence their national awakening. Some of these nations were outright placed under German monarchs. Others were controlled more subtly through advisors and economic policy. Through these new satellite states in the East, Germany began realizing the concept of a united Mittel Europa. 6 countries were of special importance for this vision: the United Baltic Duchy, Lithuania, Poland, White Ruthenia, Ukraine, and Finland. Along the Baltic Sea, 2 client states protected the northeastern frontier of the German bloc: the United Baltic Duchy and the Kingdom of Lithuania. Of all of the Oststaaten, the duchy was without a doubt the one with the closest ties to Germany, mostly due to the prominence of the local Baltic German elite in the administration. From the beginning, however, the region had been plagued by Latvian and Estonian resistance, as a majority of the population was treated like second-class citizens by their German overlords. The situation was notably different in the Kingdom of Lithuania, however. Germany initially had their very own plans for the country, but was overturned by the Lithuanian State Council, which instead elected the German Prince Wilhelm Karl von Urach as their king.
Interesting.
Von Urach ascended to the throne as Mindaugas II, and despite German protests, became a popular leader.
Interesting. It's interesting that, like, in this annexed territory ends up, because the idea that I have, right, like Germany won the war, they've got these territories. You would think that Germany would have more power to dictate how things turn out. So it's interesting to me that this local government in Lithuania essentially is like, sure, dog, we'll be a part of Germany, but we're going to do things our way and appoint a king of their own. You would think that, the Kaiser, right, would not be happy about that, being a monarch. And wouldn't you think that he would see that as a threat to his own, standing? You know what I mean? I don't know. I find that pretty interesting.
While Lithuania enjoyed an economic boom under the adept rule of Mindaugas, the Duke would pass in 1928 and be succeeded by his wildly unpopular son. In both the United Baltic Duchy and Lithuania, growing German influence did not sit well with the middle and labor classes. These sections of the population used their limited representative democracy to press against growing German meddling. Often, the Kaiserreich would find itself having to intervene in matters of state. These political pressures made it painfully clear to the people of the Baltic states that their independence was only...
And I mean, like, I can also see that being as a way that Germany would kind of use it as a means of quelling any kind of civil unrest. It's like, okay, yeah, I get it. We're the new kids on the block. We've taken over your territory. You answer to us. But, if you're good, we'll let you appoint a king and, et cetera, et cetera. You'll have some political say in the things that happen to you. And I get through history that those are things that do happen. I don't know. It's just the idea that I had was like these territories were turned over to Germany. So it seemed like Germany would have more, like I said, just more of a say overall and how a lot of these things would go down. So I don't know. I just find it interesting that this country overturned I guess what Germany was trying to do, and we're like, nah, we're not going to do that, but we're going to have our own king who is of German descent, you know what I'm saying? Like, I don't know, I just find that interesting. Because again, I still would think that, the Kaiser being a monarch would find that as almost kind of like a challenge somewhat to his rule and what he's trying to implement, you know what I mean?
Only nominally so, and that they may have traded Russian oppression for German technocracy. Surprisingly, Germany would fare better in Poland, of all places. The Polish question had been one of the Central Powers' most contentious issues for the duration of the war, as Germany and Austria severely struggled to agree on a common policy in the region. After years of conflict, it was agreed upon that the former Congress Poland would fall entirely into the German sphere, and that a German prince would be elected as its sovereign, much to the disdain of Vienna. The choice fell on the Kaiser's fourth son, Prince August of Prussia, who ascended to the formerly vacant Polish throne in early 1920. The prince, however, was challenged by the parliament, the Sejm, an influential institution conceded to the Polish people in exchange for their fealty to the Kaiser. The Sejm found allies in the Polish nobility, and the effeminate and coquettish August was deeply unpopular with his Polish subjects. For now, however, the Polish people were ready to let bygones be bygones and focused on the rebuilding of their nation. Over the 1920s, Germany progressively let go of her anti-Polish policies in Prussia, and relations between the countries normalized. German capitalists began investing heavily in the East, and the railway boom saw the Polish economy make enormous strides. This period of relative calm was in stark contrast to the chaos in Western Europe and Russia, and gave Germany hope that a German-led European order was indeed in the making. This German order would be difficult to sell to some allies, however. Germany would encounter stiff resistance in the more autonomous frontier of the German sphere, as was the case in White Ruthenia, for example. For most of the war, Belarus, or White Ruthenia as it was known in the West at the time, had not even been a declared German war aim. This was mostly because the government in Berlin did not understand much of a distinct Belarusian culture. The country was arguably the last nation in Eastern Europe to begin its national awakening, and even in 1918, Belarusian national consciousness barely existed outside of a small intelligentsia. The population of Belarusians in the Russian Empire was almost completely made up of poor and illiterate peasants, their identity limited to their own villages, only vaguely aware that they were neither Polish nor Russian nor Jews.
Interesting.
The arrival of German troops on Belarusian soil began to change things. In March 1918, the Germans advanced up to Minsk to pressure the Bolsheviks into signing a peace agreement, and the Belarusians seized upon that opportunity to proclaim the White Ruthenian Democratic Republic. The German occupation forces did not bother to recognize the fledgling state at first. Soon, however, they began to work with local independence activists against Russia. During the final peace treaty with Russia in 1921, Moscow was forced to recognize Belarusian independence on top of the nations already freed by the Brest-Litovsk Treaty. After independence, White Ruthenia found itself with the dubious honor of being the least developed nation in the Middle European bloc. Left-leaning democratic leaders would be tasked with building a new nation out of the rubble of centuries of Russian neglect.
That's also something that's interesting too, right? So that's almost like a hindrance for Germany, right? So they've gained this big territory, but it's extremely underdeveloped. Like, there's probably a lot of like rich farmland there that they could use to, you know, make goods and whatnot. But beyond that, like, the people there are illiterate, they're peasants. They probably don't have any kind of real skill set for the industrial age. And it's just not developed in any way. They're going to have to spend money and resources building railways and roads to and from to get goods there and things like that. So like, that's them taking that territory is almost a hindrance, because they're going to have to spend money to develop it. I find that, I don't know, it's pretty interesting. Plus, on the concept of forming a national identity out of nothing so interesting. Yeah.
While the Belarusian story became one of happenstance, her southern neighbor Ukraine had created quite the myth around her own independence. In the streets of Kiev, it was proudly said that Ukraine was not given independence, but rather she took it herself. In truth, the Ukrainian Revolution of 1917 to 1918 was indeed successful at driving out the Bolsheviks, but only thanks to massive Austrian and German military aid. Under the leadership of the determined and widely respected Cossack
Sounds a little
Hetman
familiar.
Pavlo Skoropadsky, the large country became the most important German-aligned bulwark in the East, enjoying without a doubt the most far-reaching autonomy of all of the Oststaaten. However, while nominally an independent state, rural Ukraine existed only with massive German economic aid, and the authoritarian leadership of the Hetman slowly turned the peasants.
Well, and that's what I'm saying, right? Like, they didn't intend to take it, but it ended up being part of the deal. And it could be a situation where it's a hindrance, is what I'm saying. You know what I mean? Like, they got it, even though they didn't want it, and it wasn't initially part of the deal. And now it's like something that, what are they going to do with it? They're either going to have to develop it, or they're just going to, you know, kind of leave it to go to ruin and what? You know what I'm saying? So it's like, do they want to spend the money to develop this territory that could potentially, again, if they have the time and resources to develop it, could be a boon in that it could, you know, a lot of farmland, a lot of peasants there that are used to farming, so they could have a lot of, you know, food and stuff to export potentially to other countries, especially after the war with famines and stuff going on. It's a way that they could, you know, make money and get rich doing that, you know. But it's just, with everything going on, you know, is that something they want to do? Or is it going to be just this territory they do nothing with and let go to ruin? At that point, if that's what happens, you know, then they could have a bunch of refugees that come in. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's something that is kind of a wild card that could either be a hindrance or could be a big benefit depending on how things were to play out. You know what I'm saying?
And the working class against him and his German backers. The poorest of Ukrainian society blamed the hetmanate for the country's economic woes. Demagogues conjured exaggerated images of fat German businessmen enriching themselves with Ukraine's natural resources, bolstering the powerful syndicalist Borotbist faction in the countryside.
Wow.
Looming tensions with bordering Russia would only...
So they had a syndicalist faction starting to come to prominence in Ukraine as well during this time. Interesting.
...further increase instability in the hetmanate. Luckily, the Germans would find a more stable and reliable allies in the far north. At the northern fringes of the empire, Finland had gained its independence by using the chaos of the October Revolution and the Civil War to oust the Russians in late 1917. The subsequent Finnish Civil War only ended with a decisive defeat of the Bolshevik forces due to Germany's intervention in March 1918. Not long after the end of the Civil War, the German Prince Friedrich Karl von Hessen was elected to the Finnish throne by the government in Helsinki. Thus, when Finland was invited into Middle Europa after the war, they were not treated as a semi-autonomous puppet state, but rather as an allied brother nation. With their strategic position at the Gulf of Finland and their border only kilometers away from Russian Petrograd, the proud Finns would become a stalwart ally in the struggle against Russian influence.
That's a pretty big deal, yeah.
Finland, Belarus, Ukraine, the United Baltic Duchy, Lithuania, and Poland. These 6 nations formed the core of Germany's ambitions for a new European order. Each nation had been built, sometimes from the ground up, with German support, rather than imperial annexation.
It's interesting that almost kind of like a United States situation is kind of happening over there. Like, all of these little countries in their territories, you know, they have their own kind of independence and ruling of themselves, but they still are under the German banner. You know what I'm saying? I don't know. I find that interesting.
German rule promised autonomy and economic collaboration. Finally, peace had come to the chaos-torn East. As syndicalism ravaged Western Europe and threatened the rule of her conservative governments, patriotic forces in the East stood with Germany to form a united front against outside threats. By the second half of the 1920s, Germany had found promising but uneven success in her nation-building efforts. The war to her west and south had not stood still, unfortunately. Soon the empire was due for a rude awakening from her post-war slumber. As the German Empire rose, across the Channel, another world empire had begun to collapse. The British Empire had been a defining feature of geopolitics ever since the 17th century. At its height, Great Britain ruled over almost a quarter of the world's population and landmass. Nobody in the world, not even Germany, would have ever suspected a leviathan of this size and scope to be as vulnerable as the empire turned out to be.
I mean, like, what was that saying? At one point in time in the British Empire, the sun never set? Something like that, you know? Like, they had territories and places, colonies all over the world, so, like, the sun literally never set on the British Empire at one point in time.
The French syndicalist revolution of 1919 was not a singular event, but rather became a spark to ignite labor frustration all over the world. While the Kaiserreich would weather the syndicalist storm, their British counterpart was not so lucky. With the outbreak of the British Civil War in late 1924, the British Isles, once the central hub for a world-spanning empire, had suddenly gone dark, throwing the delicate network of imperial dependencies into disarray.
Yeah. Well, and the thing is, too, is like Britain dealt with a lot of uprisings because it wasn't just the syndicalism, right? Like the Irish ended up revolting and seeking their own independence, which then led to Scotland doing the same thing. So that led to, you know, vulnerabilities that then led syndicalism in, and then that became radicalized syndicalism. So yeah, they had a lot of things happen in a very quick time period in Britain.
With the Royal Navy sailing off into exile in North America, the remaining colonies and territories of Great Britain were effectively cut off. Her vital ports and canals would fall under foreign control, further isolating the embattled dominions. During the early 1920s, the German Empire had watched in glee as various independence movements had chipped away at the British Empire. Sometime earlier, Ireland, India, and Egypt had already declared independence.
Yeah.
However, now in 1925, the fall of the Home Isles began to turn into a threat for Berlin as well. With the Home Isles gone, the British African and East Asian possessions were completely cut off from any kind of responsible government. In Berlin, this stoked fears of reinvigorated native nationalism that would eventually also spill over to nearby German colonies.
Yeah.
The news became...
So like they don't. I wish you would kind of show a map of some of this stuff, because then it's like Germany has a lot of colonies that they got from the war from France down in Africa. So now that the British Empire has essentially collapsed, all of those colonies are wild cards now, you know? So even like the German colonies down there in Africa and other places in the world are now surrounded by potentially other hostile nations that have sought their own independence now. So like that could then threaten everything that Germany gained, you know, colonial wise from France after the war, essentially.
Especially dire when reports turned up about secret syndicalist meddling in the aforementioned areas. Suddenly the world found itself at a crossroads. Germany had upended the world order with her victory in the Weltkrieg, but never suspected the results would be this severe. With syndicalist powers taking on an increasingly anti-imperial and anti-monarchist stance, Germany found precious few allies on the world stage when managing the fallout of the colonial crisis. In a macabre twist of fate, it was now British colonial leaders calling on Germany for protection, starting with British Hong Kong in July 1925. To many on the German home front...
Yeah, I'm pretty sure you're right. Like, Central Africa is basically owned by Germany, but then, like, southern portions of Africa become, like, its own thing. I think Egypt and another part of, like, Western Africa, you know? So, I mean, that's a lot of territory for a German colony to try to hold and for Germany to send resources to when you've got, you know, the motherland surrounded on all sides, you know? So I could easily see Germany's colonies in Africa essentially collapsing and being overtaken by other, you know, countries that have become independent nations in the wake of all of these things happening, while Germany has to focus on dealing with the syndicalism in the West and potentially a fascist regime in, you know, in the East.
Globe-spanning German interventions would amount to geopolitical suicide, completely disturbing the global power balance and potentially risking renewed conflict with France and Britain. As international emergency congresses were called, heated debates raged through the Reichstag, with fistfights and bitter rivalries punctuating the vast divides emerging in German politics.
They were doing drive-bys back in the fucking 1920s here, man.
In the end, the combination of fear and greed was too much for the empire to resist, however. Germany declared herself the protector of the colonial order, a direct counterweight to the rising syndicalist powers of the world. Colonial governors who sought protection would find as much under German guidance, and were ensured their positions would remain intact. The rule of empire was, after all, a right granted by God and Kaiser. Facing challenges worldwide, the Kaiserreich became one of the struggling inheritors of a world order that was now slowly unraveling. At this moment in history, only time could tell whether Germany would succeed in using her newfound strength to reshape the world in her own image, a vanguard of
Not looking
stability
good
and
for him
order
so far.
against the chaos of world revolution. The cruel irony was that the very victory that had given Germany strength also fundamentally undermined the world order the empire had sought to establish. With Russia in throes, America absent, and France and Britain stoking the fires, Germany stood alone as a wasting rock amid stormy seas. German resolve would be tested as it stepped up to the role of global police force. The old order had found a new champion, and the German Empire would, as they called it, guard the balance. The ancient grudges of the Great War and before were never truly forgotten.
Yeah.
They had been transformed, changed color and shape, yes, but ultimately, the world began waking up to the harsh truth. This armed peace would never last. There would be another world war,
Yep.
another Weltkrieg, and the coming decade would decide where the battle lines would be drawn.
Greed. Greed is such a human emotion, is it not? Imagine, if you will, the German noble. A fat and decrepit aristocrat, owning so much he does not even know the beginning and end of his own wealth. But even that is not enough. These nobles and old regimes exist only to consume. An eternal cycle of growth and decay. The empire exists only to serve the empire. A snake eating its own tail. And then there was syndicalism. We exist as cracks in the system, vandals in the night, stealing away as the imperial police force breaks down the door to the illegal printing station. An idea in the hearts of men that perhaps it is not right that so few own so much and so many have so little. An idea that there are
Boy, isn't that a reflection of things going on in the world today?
millions of us and few of them. That if we would only grasp for it, their power would be for naught. While the Germans drink champagne in Berlin, we sit in grimy worker bars in Saigon, Shanghai, Cape Town, Algiers, Cairo. We are the unseen hand of history, turning the dials of power back to balance. And there are more of us every day. The baker, from across the corner, he is now a syndicalist. The bowing servant, suffering abuse from his noble master, he is now a syndicalist. The doctor's daughter, clutching red literature as she exits the black market, she too is now a syndicalist. This is what the Germans, in their brutish simplicity, cannot grasp. Our real army does not ride tanks and have warships. Our real power is on the ground, in their cities, in ours, hidden behind the smiles of their subjects.
Starting to get into chaos here, you know. Again, all goes back to 40K. This is how chaos corruption spreads. You know what I'm saying? And it's happening here through syndicalism. It's all part of the chaos.
And all
It's all their
we need
plan.
is a chance, a weakness, an opening. The German Empire is overextended. a bloated relic from a bygone era. But she is also fragile. All I am looking for now is that one final straw to break the camel's back.
Kaiserreich Cinema needs you. Back the attack. Share our content. Or dash over to our alt history website.
And so
Well, there we go, my dudes. That was What If Germany Won World War I, Kaiserreich Universe Documentary, Episode 5, A Place in the Sun, by Kaiserreich Cinema. As always, links will be down below in the description to the original video here, without my commentary and reaction, and to Kaiserreich Cinema's channel. If you've been enjoying this documentary series as much as I have, you know, do me a favor, click those links and go over there and give these videos a like, and give the man a sub in his channel. You know, these videos have been really well done. You know, like, I've always loved, you know, documentaries on the Discovery Channel and the History Channel about you know, historical times stuff, you know, World War II, Vietnam, ancient times, you know, etc., etc. And the production that they have on these videos, with how well they're put together, the blending of the maps and showing the territories with the cuts of actual, you know, footage, black and white footage from those time periods, and all the political artwork going on it's phenomenal. It's amazing. It's amazing how well they've done putting this stuff together, on top of the great narration and the voice acting they have with the different characters when they're going through and giving their quotes. It's very top notch. So definitely deserves the love. So please do me a favor, like these videos, give the man a sub if you've been enjoying it. But yeah, I mean, it's very interesting how, even though Germany came out on top through World War I, they didn't really win the war, is kind of what this is showing here. They gained territory, you know, they gained colonies. France broke apart. They essentially broke Britain's grasp on colonies throughout the world, and really kind of came out on top as like the lone superpower. You know, America didn't get involved up to this point and have kind of just been doing their own thing. I'm interested to know, whenever he does get to America in his documentary, what was been going on there, you know, because during this time period was the Roaring Twenties. That's when American culture was starting to kind of come up on the rise and spread through, you know, various means, and, you know, just American culture was kind of finding itself during the 20s before the Great Depression happened. That then led to you know, the events of us joining World War II with Pearl Harbor, and that bringing us out of the Great Depression, essentially. But it's interesting seeing how all these things are playing out, how again, you know, like I've said throughout this, you know, France and Britain become unified under syndicalism. The colonies that Germany gained are essentially now under threat from other independent nations, from the British collapse. India is its own independent nation now, and the colonies, I wish I could find the map. There was at one point in time in one of the videos, one of the earlier videos, I think it was the second one maybe, they let me see if I can find a map here and I'll bring it up on the screen. But they they show a kind of a world view overview map or whatever. Yeah, let me see here, let me bring it up. Here we go. So like, this is essentially kind of, after everything, the world map, what's going on here. where the blue is essentially the Entente alliance of what's left over from the British monarchy and the French monarchy. German occupation, you know, all through Africa, and see like Germany right here is surrounded by syndicalist colonies and Entente colonies. America seems to be leaning towards syndicalism as a united front. Parts of South America, you know, they don't really show what's going on in Russia here, but essentially like Germany, the heartland of Germany and her colonies are now surrounded by hostile nations, essentially going into what is leading towards World War II. You know, so even though Germany won World War I and came out as a superpower, everything that they've gained is already a threat because other nations collapse. So it's just interesting to see, like, even though they came out on top, because of this destabilization of other countries and other events that have led, you know, that have happened, it's actually kind of worked out worse for them, you know? So I'm interested again to see where all this is going to go. I hope at some point in time, you know, I mean, this is again, right now there's only, I think, 8 episodes in the series. I'm sure there's going to be plenty more, but I'm also sure that again, with how well they're doing with the production of these videos, you know, with how well it's done, it probably takes quite a while to put all this stuff together, to write a script, get all the narration done, and cut all the historical scenes together and find them, etc., etc. But what I would love to see happen is them summarizing all of the events from the aftermath of World War I with all these nations, and then lead into World War II and give us this fantasy alternate timeline, you know, World War II. I would love to see then a document. I keep hitting my mic, I apologize. I would love to see a then, you know, kind of documentary series about this alternate timelines World War II and how those events played out and what alliances get formed, etc., etc. You know, I think that would be very fascinating to see. But yeah, so like I said, links will be down below in the description. If you'd like to join us when we do these reactions live, there is a join button underneath the video, as well as a link in the description to the YouTube membership benefits and tiers that I offer. Now, if you've been around the channel for a while and decide you want to take your support to the next level, check those out and see if you would have any interest in that. We'd love to have you guys come in and join the conversation, you know, as we're doing these live reactions. But yeah, that's gonna do it for this video, guys. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did, consider leaving a like and a sub, as it helps me and the channel grow. And we'll be back with more. There's 3 more episodes left for us to do. Episode 6, the Empire Eternal, Austria, Hungary, Serbia, Albania, and Romania. Then episode 7, Crown and the Crescent, the Ottoman Empire, Middle East, Balkans, and Bulgaria. And then currently episode 8 is the last one that he's got, which came out not too long ago. The Cycle of Empire, Bulgaria, Serbia, and the Balkans lore. So those are the last 3 videos. We'll probably end up finishing up what's on this playlist here in the coming week, and then figure out what other Kaiserreich lore stuff we might want to get into. We might go back to the What is Kaiserreich documentary series that I believe is also from Kaiser Cat Cinema, and kind of go through how the mod formed, and all that kind of stuff. So we might go and look at some of that once we finish this as well. But anyway, like I said, that's gonna do it for this video, guys. Thanks for watching. Appreciate you. Hope you enjoyed it, and hope you're having yourselves a wonderful day. We'll talk to you on the next one.